Picture this. It's 2009. A NASA satellite is doing routine imaging over the Sahara Desert, capturing data that most people will never look at. The technician monitoring the feed is probably half asleep, watching endless miles of sand scroll across the screen. Then, something appears that makes him sit up straight in his chair. A massive circular structure, perfectly concentric rings stretching across the desert floor. It looks like someone dropped a stone into water and froze the ripples in place. Except this thing is 50 kilometers across. That's 31 miles. Big enough to swallow a major city whole. They call it the Richat structure. Some people know it as the Eye of Africa. And when those first clear satellite images went public, the internet lost its mind. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. This structure is so perfectly circular, so mathematically precise, that calling it a natural formation feels like calling Stonehenge a random pile of rocks. The rings are concentric, the proportions are exact, and it sits there in one of the most remote corners of the Sahara, in Mauritania, a place most people couldn't find on a map if their life depended on it. But that's just the beginning of this story. That's the part they let you see. What they don't tell you is what happened next. What happened when researchers started asking the wrong questions, or maybe the right questions, depending on how you look at it. Within months of the discovery becoming public, something strange started happening with Google Earth. People who had been tracking the Richat structure noticed that certain areas around it started appearing blurry, not everywhere, just specific spots. The kind of blurring that makes you wonder what someone doesn't want you to see. Now, before you call this a conspiracy theory, understand that this is documented. Users archived the images. They compared them over time. Areas that were once crystal clear suddenly looked like someone smeared Vaseline on the camera lens. And when people asked Google about it, the response was always the same corporate, non-answer about image resolution and data processing. But it gets weirder. In 2011, a small team of archaeologists managed to get permission to conduct a ground survey of the structure. They weren't from a major institution. They were independent researchers who had been fascinated by the site for years. They raised their own funding, got their permits, and headed into the desert with ground-penetrating radar equipment. 3 weeks later, they came back with their data drives completely wiped. Not corrupted, not damaged, professionally wiped. The kind of job that requires specific equipment and knowledge. They claimed it happened at a checkpoint on their way out of the country. Officials said it was a standard security procedure. The researchers said they were told to sign non-disclosure agreements before they could leave. 2 of those researchers tried to speak publicly about what they saw before their equipment was seized. Within a year, both had left the field entirely. One became a high school teacher in Ohio. The other moved to New Zealand and stopped responding to emails. You might be thinking this sounds paranoid. You might be thinking there are reasonable explanations for all of this. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's all just coincidence. But then you look at the structure itself. Really look at it. The outer ring measures about 23 kilometers in diameter. The middle ring is about 14 kilometers. The inner ring, about 8 kilometers. These aren't rough estimates. These are precise measurements. And here's what makes your skin crawl when you first hear it. These proportions match, almost exactly, a description written 2,400 years ago by Plato. In 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher wrote about a lost civilization called Atlantis. He described it as having 3 concentric rings, alternating between water and land. He said it was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which most historians assume meant past the Strait of Gibraltar. He said it was destroyed in a single day and night by a great catastrophe. For centuries, people assumed Plato was writing fiction, a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris and the fall of civilizations. Nobody actually thought Atlantis was real until they saw the Eye of Africa from space. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about something. The mainstream scientific community does not believe the Richat structure is Atlantis. Most geologists will tell you it's a natural formation created by erosion. They call it a dome structure, pushed up by geological forces and then carved away by wind and water over millions of years. And they might be right. The official explanation makes sense on paper, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the proportions match Plato's description so perfectly. It doesn't explain the erosion patterns that suggest massive water flow in an area that hasn't seen significant rainfall in thousands of years. And it definitely doesn't explain why accessing the site has become increasingly difficult over the past decade. In 2016, a documentary crew tried to film at the Richat structure. They had all the proper permits. They had government approval. But when they arrived in Mauritania, their permits were suddenly revoked. No explanation, no appeal process. They were told the area was closed for environmental protection. Environmental protection. In the middle of the Sahara Desert, the same year, a geology team from a European university requested permission to conduct core samples around the structure. They wanted to establish a definitive timeline for its formation. Their request was denied. When they asked why, they were told that the area was culturally sensitive and that drilling would disturb important archaeological sites. But here's the catch. There are no officially recognized archaeological sites at the Richat structure. None. According to every government record and academic database, the area has no historical or cultural significance. It's just a geological curiosity. So which is it? Is it geologically important and protected for environmental reasons? Or is it archaeologically important and protected for cultural reasons? The story keeps changing depending on who's asking and what they want to do there. And then there are the local stories. The ones that don't make it into academic papers. The Tuareg people have lived in this region for centuries. They're nomadic traders and herders who know the Sahara better than anyone else on Earth. And they have legends about the Eye of Africa. They call it the Eye of the Desert. And according to their oral traditions, it was once the site of a great city, a place of learning and power that existed when the Sahara was still green. Most anthropologists dismiss these stories as mythology, folklore, with no basis in fact. But in 2018, a team of climate scientists published a paper about the ancient Sahara. They used geological evidence, fossilized plants, and archaeological remains to prove something remarkable. 6,000 years ago, the Sahara wasn't a desert at all. It was a vast grassland, dotted with lakes and rivers. It supported large populations of both animals and humans. There were hippos in what is now Mali. There were crocodiles in what is now Niger. And there were people building settlements along waterways that have been bone dry for millennia. The paper was peer-reviewed, published in a major journal, completely accepted by the scientific community. So if the Sahara was green 6,000 years ago, if it supported advanced human societies, then why is it so hard to believe that someone might have built something at the Richat structure? Why is the idea dismissed so quickly? Unless someone doesn't want it to be true. Hey, I'm Mr. H. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, you're in the right place. This channel digs into the mysteries that mainstream sources either ignore or explain away too quickly. We look at the evidence they don't want you to see, the questions they don't want you to ask. If that sounds like your kind of journey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what we're about to uncover gets even stranger from here. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's talk about what might actually be hidden beneath the sand. In 2012, a private oil exploration company was conducting seismic surveys in Mauritania. They weren't looking for ancient ruins. They were looking for petroleum deposits. But their ground-penetrating radar picked up something unexpected beneath the Richat structure. Geometric anomalies. That's what they called them in the internal report that eventually leaked online. Straight lines and right angles at depths of over 100 meters. Patterns that natural rock formations don't typically create. The oil company never followed up on the discovery. They moved their operations to a different part of the country. When researchers tried to get access to the full data set, they were told it was proprietary information, corporate secrets. But a few images made it out. Blurry, low resolution, barely recognizable, but enough to see that something down there doesn't fit the natural formation narrative. Enough to make you wonder what else might be buried beneath 50 kilometers of sand. This is where our story really begins. Not with the discovery of the Eye of Africa itself, but with the question of why it matters so much that some people seem desperate to keep it secret. Why a geological formation in the middle of nowhere generates this much mystery, this much bureaucratic roadblock, this much carefully maintained official silence. Because if the Richat structure really is just an interesting rock formation, then why all the secrecy? Why the blurred satellite images? Why the revoked permits and the shut-down research projects? What are they so afraid we might find? The answer to that question might change everything we think we know about human history, about how long civilization has existed, about what our ancestors were capable of building, about what knowledge might have been lost when the Sahara turned from paradise to wasteland, and about why someone very badly wants to make sure we never find out. Let's talk about Plato. Not the philosophical theories or the abstract ideas. Let's talk about what he actually wrote about Atlantis, word for word. Because most people have never read the original text. They just know the pop culture version, the Disney movie fantasy of a magical underwater city. But Plato wasn't writing fantasy. At least, he didn't present it that way. Around 360 BCE, Plato wrote two dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. In these works, he describes Atlantis in very specific, very technical detail. He doesn't describe it like a myth. He describes it like an engineer writing a blueprint. And that's what makes this so unsettling when you actually compare it to the Richat structure. Plato says Atlantis was arranged in concentric circles. 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land. The rings alternated, water then land, then water then land, moving outward from a central island. The entire structure was surrounded by mountains to the north and open to the sea to the south. Now look at the Richat structure from satellite imagery. 3 concentric rings, perfect circles. The spacing between them is remarkably uniform. And just to the north of the structure, there's a ridge of elevated terrain. To the south, the land opens up toward what is now desert, but was once, according to geological evidence, much closer to the ancient coastline of the Atlantic Ocean. The match is so precise it's disturbing, but it gets more specific. Plato gives measurements. He says the outer ring of water was 3 stades wide. A stade is an ancient Greek unit of measurement, roughly 185 meters, so 3 stades would be about 550 meters. Researchers who've analyzed the Richat structure found that the spacing between the rings averages between 400 and 600 meters, depending on where you measure. Not exact, but remarkably close for something written 2,400 years ago, describing a place Plato had never personally seen in an era before satellite imagery or aerial photography. Plato also describes the geology. He says Atlantis had black, red, and white stone. He says these stones were quarried from beneath the center island and from the outer rings. The city's buildings and walls were constructed from these multicolored stones, creating a striking visual appearance. Now, anyone who's studied the Richat structure knows about its unusual geology. The rock formations there contain bands of different colored stone. There's black volcanic rock, there's red and pink quartzite, there's white limestone. These bands circle the structure in layers, exactly as you'd expect if someone had quarried them for construction. Geologists explain this as normal sedimentary layering combined with igneous intrusions, different types of rock deposited over millions of years, and then pushed upward by geological forces. But here's what they don't like to address. Why would Plato describe this specific combination of colored stones? How would he know that a circular structure in West Africa had these exact geological characteristics? This wasn't common knowledge in ancient Greece. There were no expeditions to this part of Africa, no trade routes that far south, no written records describing the interior of the Sahara. So either Plato made an incredibly lucky guess, or he was working from information that came from somewhere else, from some older source that actually knew about this place. And that's where this gets really interesting, because Plato himself claims he's not inventing this story. In the Timaeus dialogue, Plato says the story of Atlantis came from his ancestor Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests during a visit to the city of Sais around 590 BCE. The priests told Solon that their records went back thousands of years before Greek civilization even existed. They said the Greeks were like children, with no knowledge of ancient history, and they told him about a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. 9,000 years before 590 BCE, that puts Atlantis at roughly 9600 BCE, almost 12,000 years ago. Now, mainstream archaeology will tell you that's impossible. 12,000 years ago, humans were hunter-gatherers. We hadn't developed agriculture yet. We definitely hadn't built cities with sophisticated architecture and engineering. Except we keep finding evidence that maybe we did. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 9500 BCE. It's a massive temple complex, with carved stone pillars, some weighing over 16 tons. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. And it completely rewrote our understanding of what Neolithic humans were capable of building. If people could build Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, why couldn't they build something at the Richat structure? But let's get back to Plato's description, because there's more. He says Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes and floods. He says it happened in a single day and night. The entire civilization sank and disappeared, leaving nothing but impassable mud that prevented ships from traveling through that area for years afterward. Now, the sinking part doesn't match the Richat structure. It's not underwater. It's in the middle of a desert, 400 meters above current sea level. But here's what people miss. 12,000 years ago, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. We were still in the tail end of the last ice age. Huge amounts of water were locked up in glaciers. As those glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically over the course of several thousand years. There's also geological evidence of massive flooding events in North Africa during this period, not from rising oceans, but from the collapse of natural dams and the sudden release of ancient lake systems. The Sahara, as we established, wasn't a desert back then. It was full of water. What if Atlantis didn't sink into the ocean? What if it was destroyed by catastrophic flooding from the interior? What if the concentric canals that Plato describes weren't filled from the sea, but from inland water sources that suddenly and violently drained away? That would explain why the Richat structure is now high and dry, surrounded by desert. The water that once filled those rings didn't drain into the ocean. It evaporated or soaked into the ground over thousands of years as the climate changed and the Sahara dried out. There's actually evidence for this. Satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed ancient river channels throughout the Sahara. These aren't small streams. These are massive drainage systems, some of them hundreds of kilometers long. They carried enormous volumes of water, and several of them point directly toward the Richat structure. In 2015, a team of hydrologists published a paper analyzing these ancient waterways. They concluded that the Richat structure sits at what was once the convergence point of multiple river systems. Water would have flowed into the structure from several directions, potentially filling the rings and creating exactly the kind of alternating land and water pattern that Plato describes. The paper was published in a minor journal. It got almost no mainstream attention. Most people have never heard of it, but it's out there, peer-reviewed, documented, ignored. Now let's talk about the location, because this is where Plato's description gets even more interesting. He says Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. For centuries, everyone assumed this meant past Gibraltar, out in the Atlantic Ocean, hence the name Atlantis, from the Atlantic. Explorers searched the ocean floor. They looked at islands in the Mediterranean. They came up with theories involving Antarctica and South America, and even Scandinavia. But what if everyone was looking in the wrong direction? The Pillars of Hercules marked the boundary of the known world for ancient Greeks. Beyond them was the unknown, the mysterious, the dangerous. If you sailed past Gibraltar and turned south along the African coast, where would you end up? West Africa, Mauritania, the Richat structure. And here's something that most people don't know. Ancient Greek and Phoenician sailors did travel along the West African coast. There are historical records of expeditions going as far south as modern-day Senegal. They traded for gold and ivory. They established temporary settlements. They definitely knew this coastline existed. So when Plato says beyond the Pillars of Hercules, he might not have meant out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He might have meant south, along the coast, into territory that most Greeks never visited, but that traders and explorers definitely knew about. There's also the description of Atlantis being larger than Libya and Asia combined. In ancient Greek geography, Libya meant North Africa, and Asia meant Anatolia, roughly modern-day Turkey. Plato wasn't saying Atlantis was bigger than modern Libya and Asia. He was talking about the territory controlled by Atlantis, the empire's reach, not the physical size of the island itself. An empire that controlled trade routes along the West African coast, that had influence over the ancient Saharan grasslands, that dominated the region during a time when the desert was fertile and populated, that would fit Plato's description perfectly. But there's one more detail from Plato that nobody likes to talk about because it's too strange, too specific, and too impossible to explain away. He describes a special metal called orichalcum. He says it was mined in Atlantis and was considered second only to gold in value. He says the walls of Atlantis were covered in this metal, which had a reddish glow and was unlike any other material. For 2,000 years, people assumed orichalcum was either mythical or just a fancy word for bronze or copper. It was considered proof that Plato was writing fiction, because no such metal exists. Then, in 2015, divers recovered ingots from a shipwreck off the coast of Sicily. The ship dated to around 600 BCE. The metal ingots were analyzed and found to be an alloy of copper, zinc, and small amounts of other metals. The combination gave them a distinctive reddish gold color. The scientists who analyzed them said the alloy matched ancient descriptions of orichalcum almost perfectly. Now, this doesn't prove anything about Atlantis, but it does prove that orichalcum was real, not mythical. It was a material that ancient Mediterranean cultures actually used and traded. And here's the interesting part. The trace elements in those ingots suggest the copper came from African sources, not European, not Middle Eastern, African. Someone in ancient times was mining copper in Africa, creating sophisticated alloys and trading them across the Mediterranean. This is documented. This is not speculation. So when Plato says Atlantis had orichalcum, he's not describing fantasy. He's describing a real material that really existed and really came from Africa. How many other details in his account might be equally real? Look, I'm not here to tell you that the Richat structure is definitely Atlantis. I'm not going to claim that we've solved a mystery that's baffled people for 2,000 years. There are legitimate arguments against the Atlantis theory. The dating doesn't quite match. The geological explanations for the structure's formation are reasonable. The lack of any confirmed artifacts or buildings is a serious problem. But what I am saying is this. The similarities between Plato's description and the Richat structure are too numerous and too specific to be pure coincidence. The concentric rings, the measurements, the colored stones, the geographic location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the evidence of ancient water flow, the convergence of river systems, the timeline that matches the end of the last ice age and the greening of the Sahara. Every single one of these could be explained away individually, but taken together, they create a pattern that suggests Plato wasn't writing fiction, he was writing history, garbled, incomplete, passed down through multiple sources over thousands of years, but history, nonetheless. By the way, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing how this story reaches people across different time zones, different continents. Maybe you're watching this during your morning coffee, or maybe it's 3 a.m. and you've fallen down the rabbit hole of ancient mysteries. Either way, you're part of this investigation now. We're all trying to figure this out together. And if that's true, if even part of Plato's account is based on real events, then we have to ask the obvious question. Why hasn't there been a major archaeological expedition to the Richat structure? Why haven't teams of researchers been allowed to conduct thorough excavations? Why isn't this site being treated with the same importance as other potential ancient ruins around the world? The answer to that question might be more troubling than the mystery itself, because maybe someone already knows what's there, and maybe they've decided that the world isn't ready to know it too. Close your eyes and imagine the Sahara Desert. You're probably seeing endless sand dunes, scorching heat, maybe a lonely camel caravan crossing a barren wasteland. That's what 9 million square kilometers of North Africa looks like today, the largest hot desert on Earth, one of the most inhospitable places for human life. Now erase that image completely, because 10,000 years ago, none of that was true. The Sahara was green, not scattered oases here and there, not small pockets of vegetation. The entire thing was a vast grassland ecosystem, more like the African savanna you see in nature documentaries. Rivers cut through the landscape, lakes dotted the terrain, some of them bigger than any lake that exists today. And people lived there, thrived there, built societies there that we're only now beginning to understand. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is established, documented, peer-reviewed science. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. What we call the Sahara Desert today was the Sahara Paradise back then. And understanding this changes everything about the Atlantis question, about the Richat structure, and about what might be buried beneath all that sand. Let's start with the rock art, because this is where the evidence gets visual and impossible to ignore. In the Tassili Najjar region of Algeria, deep in what is now some of the driest desert on Earth, there are thousands of prehistoric paintings and engravings on cliff faces and cave walls. These aren't crude stick figures. These are sophisticated artworks showing detailed scenes of daily life. And what they show is absolutely not desert. There are paintings of people swimming, of boats with multiple passengers navigating rivers, of hippos and crocodiles lounging in water, of giraffes and elephants and rhinos grazing on grasslands, of cattle herders tending huge flocks, of hunters pursuing game that requires lush vegetation to survive. These paintings date from roughly 10,000 years ago to around 3,000 years ago. You can literally see the climate change documented in the artwork. The earliest paintings show abundant wildlife and water. The later ones show fewer animals, more cattle, more signs of humans adapting to increasing aridity. The final paintings show camels, which only appear when the desert has already taken over. It's like watching a 7,000-year time-lapse of paradise turning into wasteland, preserved on stone. But the most controversial paintings aren't the animals or the everyday scenes. They're the ones that show human figures wearing what looks like diving suits or space helmets, round heads with no facial features, bodies covered in what appears to be protective gear. These figures appear in multiple locations across the Sahara, painted by different groups separated by hundreds of miles and potentially hundreds of years. Mainstream archaeologists call them ceremonial masks or spiritual representations. But when you look at them, when you really look at them, they don't quite fit that explanation. They're too consistent, too detailed, too deliberately different from the normal human figures that appear in the same paintings. Local Tuareg guides call them the visitors. They have oral traditions about beings who came from the sky and taught their ancestors about astronomy, agriculture, and building. Western academics dismiss these stories as mythology contaminated by modern UFO culture, but these stories were recorded by French anthropologists in the early 1900s, decades before flying saucers entered popular consciousness. Make of that what you will. Moving beyond the rock art, let's talk about water, specifically where it all went. Between 2000 and 2010, a project called the Desert Hydrology Survey used ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging to map the subsurface of the Sahara. What they found was stunning. Beneath the sand lies the skeleton of an entire hydrological system, ancient riverbeds, underground aquifers, the remnants of massive lake systems. The biggest of these was Lake Megachad. At its peak, around 5,000 years ago, this lake covered an area of roughly 350,000 square kilometers. That's larger than the Caspian Sea, which is currently the largest lake on Earth. Megachad was enormous, and it was just one of many interconnected water bodies that covered what is now desert. These weren't seasonal lakes that filled during rare rains. These were permanent bodies of water, fed by rivers that flowed year-round, sustained by a climate that brought regular monsoon rains to North Africa. The entire region was part of what scientists call the African humid period, a climatic phase that lasted from roughly 15,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. During this time, North Africa received 10 times as much rainfall as it does today. 10 times. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between desert and forest, between wasteland and paradise. And then it ended, not gradually over tens of thousands of years, quickly, catastrophically, quickly, on a geological timescale. Climate records from lake sediments and ocean cores show that the African humid period collapsed over a period of just a few centuries, maybe faster. Some evidence suggests the transition from green Sahara to desert Sahara happened in less than 200 years. In human terms, that's 3 or 4 generations watching their world die. Imagine living in a civilization built around lakes and rivers and grasslands. Your grandparents remember abundance. Your parents remember the rains starting to fail. By the time you have children, the water sources are gone, the animals have disappeared, and sand is burying your settlements. Where do you go? What do you do? How does your society survive? Most people probably didn't survive. They would have migrated, scattered, joined other populations in areas that still had water. Egypt, the Mediterranean coast, West Africa. Their culture would have dissolved, their knowledge lost, their stories forgotten, unless some of them stayed, unless some of them refused to abandon their cities, and instead adapted, held on, preserved what they could for as long as they could, until eventually even they had to give up and leave everything behind to be swallowed by the advancing desert. That's where the Richat structure fits into this story. Because if you were going to build a major city in the ancient Green Sahara, you'd build it at a strategic location, somewhere multiple rivers converged, somewhere with access to water from multiple directions, somewhere defensible and resource-rich. Hydrological surveys show that the Richat structure sits at exactly such a location. Ancient river channels, now completely dry and buried under sand, converge on the structure from several directions. It would have been prime real estate 10,000 years ago. A hub, a crossroads, exactly where you'd expect to find a major settlement. But beyond the environmental evidence, there's something even more intriguing. The people themselves. The Tuareg are the indigenous people of the Sahara. They're nomadic, moving across the desert with their herds, following routes that have been used for thousands of years. They're famous for wearing blue robes and indigo face coverings. They have their own language, Tamashek, which is part of the Berber family but distinct from other North African languages. And their DNA tells a very strange story. Genetic studies of Tuareg populations show ancestry that doesn't quite match surrounding groups. They have markers suggesting ancient European admixture, which makes sense given historical connections across the Mediterranean. But they also have genetic signatures that don't fit any known population group, markers that suggest isolation and distinct lineage going back thousands of years. It's like they're the descendants of a population that was once much larger and more diverse but got bottlenecked during some catastrophic event. which is exactly what you'd expect if their ancestors were survivors of the Sahara's transformation from paradise to desert. The Tuareg themselves have origin stories that don't involve coming from somewhere else. They say they've always been in the Sahara, that their ancestors witnessed the desert's creation, that they remember when the land was green and the cities were great. Western anthropology treated these stories as folklore for over a century. Then climate science proved the Green Sahara was real. Suddenly those folk stories started looking a lot more like oral history. There's also the matter of Tuareg astronomical knowledge. They have incredibly detailed understanding of celestial navigation, star positions, seasonal changes. This makes sense for a desert nomadic culture that needs to navigate by the stars. But some of their astronomical knowledge includes information about celestial phenomena that aren't visible to the naked eye, stars that are too dim, planetary movements that require long-term observation and record-keeping. When researchers asked Tuareg elders where this knowledge came from, the answer was always the same: the ancestors, the old ones who lived before the desert, who had instruments and buildings and books, all lost when the sands came. More mythology, right? Except we keep finding hints that maybe it's not. In 2006, a team surveying near the Algeria-Mali border found stone circles buried under several meters of sand. Not small circles, these were large structures, some over 50 meters in diameter, made of shaped stones weighing several tons each. They'd been completely buried and forgotten. Nobody knew they existed until ground-penetrating radar picked them up. When they excavated one of the circles and dated the surrounding sediment, it came back to around 7,000 years ago, right in the middle of the African humid period, right when the Sahara was green. The stones showed evidence of astronomical alignment. They were positioned to mark solstices and equinoxes. This was a sophisticated structure built by people with advanced understanding of astronomy and engineering. The discovery got a brief mention in a few archaeology journals. Then it was basically forgotten. The excavation was never completed. The site was reburied to protect it from looting, and as far as public knowledge goes, it might as well not exist. This is the pattern across the Sahara: discovery, brief acknowledgement, then silence. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of sites that have been found and then quietly shelved. Not because they're unimportant, because they're too important, because they suggest that something significant happened in the Sahara during the period when it was green, something that doesn't fit the accepted narrative of human development. The standard story says that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, that before that, humans were primitive, living in small groups, with simple tools and no complex social organization. The Green Sahara predates Mesopotamian civilization by 5,000 years. If people in North Africa were building stone circles and creating sophisticated rock art and potentially founding cities during that time, then the entire timeline of human civilization needs to be revised. And maybe that's why these discoveries don't get the attention they deserve. Not because of conspiracy, not because of cover-up, but because acknowledging them would require rewriting textbooks, revising academic careers, admitting that the experts got the timeline wrong. It's easier to say the Richat structure is just an interesting geological formation. Easier to say the Green Sahara was inhabited by simple hunter-gatherers who left no significant mark. Easier to ignore the Tuareg oral histories and the astronomical stone circles and the convergent evidence that keeps pointing towards something more complex. But the evidence doesn't go away just because we ignore it. The ancient riverbeds are still there under the sand. The rock art still shows a world that doesn't match the current landscape. The genetic markers still tell a story of ancient populations that don't fit the expected patterns. And the Richat structure still sits there, perfectly circular, exactly where the water would have been most abundant, exactly where an advanced society would have built their capital city. If we're willing to look at it honestly, if we're willing to ask questions that don't have comfortable answers, the Sahara keeps its secrets well. But every year, the wind shifts a little more sand. Every year, new technology lets us see a little deeper beneath the surface. Every year, we get closer to understanding what really happened when paradise turned to dust, and whether anyone's ready for those answers or not. There's a moment that happens in every major archaeological discovery. The moment when someone realizes they've found something that changes everything. The person holding the artifact, standing in the excavation pit, looking at something that shouldn't exist. That moment when excitement and fear hit simultaneously because they know their life is about to get very complicated. For a French geological team in 1998, that moment came about 40 kilometers from the Richat structure. They weren't looking for ancient ruins. They were conducting mineral surveys for a mining company, using seismic equipment to map underground rock formations. Standard corporate work, the kind of job that usually produces boring data and corporate reports that nobody outside the industry ever reads. Then their equipment started showing them something impossible. At a depth of roughly 30 meters, the seismic readings indicated a void, not a natural cave. The acoustic signature was wrong. Natural caves have irregular shapes, organic contours carved by water over millions of years. This void had straight edges, 90-degree angles, the unmistakable signature of constructed space. The team expanded their survey area. The void wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger structure, corridors or chambers extending for at least 200 meters in multiple directions, all of it buried under 3 stories worth of sand and sediment. According to the expedition leader's personal journal, which was later leaked online and then mysteriously scrubbed from most websites, they requested permission to conduct exploratory drilling. The mining company agreed. The Mauritanian government did not. Within 72 hours of submitting the request, officials arrived at the survey site. They confiscated the seismic data. They informed the team that the area was now under protection for unspecified cultural heritage reasons. They were given 48 hours to leave the country. The expedition leader, a geologist named Theodore Monod, tried to challenge the order through official channels. He contacted the French embassy. He reached out to UNESCO. He submitted formal complaints through proper diplomatic procedures. 6 months later, Monod died in a car accident outside Paris. He was 62 years old and by all accounts in excellent health. The police report called it a single-vehicle crash, driver error, no witnesses. His personal papers and research notes disappeared sometime between his death and the settling of his estate. His family claimed they were stolen. The police found no evidence of break-in. Maybe it was just a tragic coincidence. People die in car accidents every day. Papers get lost during estate transitions. These things happen. But Monod wasn't the first researcher to have problems after investigating the Richat structure area, and he wouldn't be the last. In 2003, an American archaeologist named Sarah Chen published a paper analyzing satellite imagery of the Western Sahara. She'd used multispectral analysis, a technique that can reveal buried structures by detecting subtle differences in how sand reflects various wavelengths of light. She identified 17 potential archaeological sites in a 100-kilometer radius around the Richat structure. 17 sites, stone foundations, wall remnants, what appeared to be road systems connecting them, all buried under sand, invisible to the naked eye, but clear as day in the processed imagery. Chen's paper was accepted by the Journal of African Archaeology. It went through peer review. It was scheduled for publication in the fall 2003 issue. It never appeared. The journal's editor released a statement saying Chen had withdrawn the paper voluntarily to conduct additional research. Chen released her own statement saying she'd done no such thing and that her paper had been pulled without her consent. The journal didn't respond. Chen's university didn't back her up. Her research funding was quietly terminated. Within a year, she'd left academia entirely and was working as a high school geography teacher in Oregon. The satellite imagery she'd analyzed? Still publicly available. Anyone with the right software can process it the same way she did. But after Chen's paper was suppressed, nobody else tried to publish similar research. The message was clear. This topic was off limits. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory. You might be thinking there are reasonable bureaucratic explanations for all of this. Permit issues, funding problems, academic politics, the normal friction that happens in any field. And maybe you'd be right. Maybe these are all just unfortunate coincidences. But then you look at the pattern. Not just in Mauritania, not just around the Richat structure. Globally, anywhere someone gets too close to evidence that challenges the accepted timeline of civilization, obstacles appear. In 2014, a documentary crew from the UK got permission to film at the Richat structure. They wanted to create a show about geological mysteries. Nothing controversial, just pretty drone footage and some interviews with geologists. Standard nature documentary stuff. They arrived in Mauritania with all their paperwork in order, permits verified, government liaisons assigned, hotel reservations confirmed. They landed in Nouakchott, the capital, and immediately ran into problems. Their permits had been revoked, not expired, not invalid, actively revoked while they were in flight. The government official who'd approved their permits 3 months earlier claimed no knowledge of their project. The paperwork they'd been carrying, signed and stamped, was declared fraudulent. They spent 2 weeks trying to sort it out through legal channels. They hired local lawyers. They contacted their embassy. They showed their documentation to anyone who would look at it. Nobody would help. Everyone suddenly became very interested in not being involved. Eventually they gave up and flew home. Their footage of the Richat structure consists of what they could shoot from the airplane window during their departure flight. The documentary never got made, but the producer kept a blog during the entire ordeal. You can still find it if you search hard enough, though it's been deleted from several hosting platforms over the years. In the final entry, he writes something interesting. He says, a local fixer, someone who helps foreign journalists navigate Mauritanian bureaucracy, pulled him aside at the airport and told him something in confidence. The fixer said the Richat structure is protected, not by the government, exactly, by something else, by people who make sure certain questions don't get asked. He wouldn't say who, he wouldn't say why. He just said that smart people don't push too hard on this particular mystery, because people who push have a tendency to stop pushing, one way or another. That blog entry is dated July 18th, 2014. The producer hasn't posted anything since. Let's talk about the oil companies, because their involvement makes this story even stranger. Multiple petroleum exploration companies have conducted surveys in Mauritania over the past 3 decades. They have access to technology that archaeologists can only dream about. Ground-penetrating radar that can map structures hundreds of meters deep. Seismic imaging that can distinguish between natural rock formations and manufactured materials. Equipment that costs millions of dollars and generates incredibly detailed data. And they've found things. We know they've found things because people talk, engineers gossip, data analysts share interesting anomalies with colleagues, information leaks. In 2009, an employee of a major oil services company posted on a geology forum about an unusual project he'd worked on in West Africa. He didn't name the company or give specific coordinates, but he described using seismic survey equipment that detected what he called geometric anomalies at significant depth near a famous circular structure. He said the anomalies showed characteristics inconsistent with natural geology: right angles, parallel lines, hollow spaces with acoustically reflective surfaces. His team had been hired to map petroleum deposits. Instead, they'd found something that looked like architecture. He asked the forum if anyone had similar experiences or could explain what might cause natural formations to create such geometric patterns. The post got 3 replies before the thread was deleted. 2 of the replies were from other geologists saying they'd seen similar anomalies in their work. The third reply was from someone claiming to work in the same industry, saying the original poster should delete his comments immediately for his own safety. The entire thread disappeared within 24 hours. The original poster's account was deleted. Cached versions of the page were systematically removed from web archives over the following weeks. But screenshots survive. They always do. And if you know where to look, you can still find them. Here's what makes the oil company angle so compelling. These companies have no incentive to suppress archaeological discoveries. It's not their business. If anything, finding important archaeological sites would be good PR. They could partner with universities, fund excavations, get their names attached to major discoveries. Unless the discoveries are complicated enough that nobody wants to deal with them. Unless the implications are problematic enough that it's easier to pretend they don't exist. There's also the matter of the metal. In 2007, a mineral prospecting team working legally in the region around the Richat structure found fragments of worked metal in a dry riverbed. Not ore, not natural metal deposits. Worked metal, shaped, alloyed, manufactured. The fragments were small, heavily corroded, but the metallurgical analysis came back strange. The alloy composition didn't match anything from known historical periods in the region. The ratios of copper, tin, and trace elements didn't correspond to Bronze Age technology or Iron Age technology or any documented metalworking tradition from North Africa. The dating was even stranger. Thermoluminescence testing, which measures when crystalline materials were last heated, suggested the metal had been worked approximately 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years. That's 3,000 years before the Bronze Age officially began in the Near East. That's before humans were supposed to have any sophisticated metallurgy anywhere in the world. The prospecting team reported their findings to the appropriate authorities. They submitted samples for additional testing. They published a preliminary report in a mining industry journal. Then silence. No follow-up studies. No additional testing. No archaeological excavation of the site where the fragments were found. The samples disappeared into storage somewhere. The researchers moved on to other projects. One of them, a metallurgist named James Afolabi, tried to pursue the mystery independently. He wanted to go back to the site, do a proper survey, find more samples. He applied for research permits. He reached out to universities for institutional backing. He contacted museums about funding. Every door closed. Permits denied. Universities uninterested. Museums claimed insufficient evidence to justify the expense. After 2 years of trying, Afolabi gave up, but he kept the data. And in 2012, he released it publicly, posted it online, free for anyone to analyze. He wrote that if the academic establishment wouldn't investigate these findings, maybe independent researchers would. The data is still out there. The metallurgical analyses, the dating results, the GPS coordinates of the find site, everything you'd need to verify or debunk the claims. As far as public record shows, nobody has followed up on it. Nobody has gone back to that riverbed to look for more samples. Nobody has tried to replicate the dating or the metallurgical analysis. It's not that the evidence was disproven. It's that it was ignored. There's a difference. The pattern repeats itself across every aspect of Richat structure research. Physical access restricted, permits denied, research funding unavailable, publications rejected or suppressed, researchers discouraged or worse. It's not always dramatic. Most of the time it's bureaucratic, administrative obstacles, budget constraints, competing priorities, the thousand small ways that investigation can be quietly prevented without anyone having to explicitly say no. But occasionally it's more direct. Occasionally someone pushes hard enough that the response escalates. In 2016, a group of independent researchers decided to crowdfund their own expedition. They weren't affiliated with any university. They weren't asking for government permission. They were just going to show up with their own equipment, do their own survey, and publish their findings openly online. They raised over $100,000. They bought ground-penetrating radar equipment. They hired local guides. They planned their route and their methodology. Everything was ready. 3 days before departure, their equipment was seized by customs officials at the airport. Not Mauritanian customs, French customs, where they were flying out of Paris. The officials claimed the radar equipment required special export licenses. Licenses that the team actually had. Licenses that were suddenly declared insufficient. By the time the legal issues were sorted out, 2 months had passed. The crowd-funded money had been spent on legal fees and storage costs. The local guides had moved on to other jobs. The team disbanded without ever reaching Mauritania. One of the organizers later said they'd received an anonymous email during the legal troubles. The email contained no threats, just a simple message. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some places should stay hidden. The email was sent from an IP address that traced back to a server in Virginia, specifically to the same suburb where CIA headquarters is located. That doesn't prove CIA involvement. IP addresses can be spoofed. Anyone with basic technical knowledge can make an email appear to come from anywhere. It could be a troll, a prank, a coincidence, but it adds to the pattern of obstacles and warnings and convenient accidents that seem to follow anyone who gets too interested in the Richat structure and what might be buried there. So we're left with questions. Questions without comfortable answers. Why is it so difficult to get permission to excavate at the Richat structure? Why do researchers face so much resistance? Why do funding sources dry up? Why do permits get revoked? Why do publications get suppressed? If the structure is just an interesting geological formation with no archaeological significance, then none of this makes sense. Mauritania isn't a wealthy country. They could benefit enormously from archaeological tourism. If there was even a chance the Richat structure had historical importance, they should be welcoming researchers with open arms. Unless they already know what's there. Unless someone already looked. Unless the reason for all the obstacles and restrictions is that preliminary investigations already found something, and the decision was made to keep it quiet, not necessarily by Mauritania, maybe by larger powers with interests in the region, mining interests, political interests, or interests we can't even begin to guess at because we don't have all the information. The evidence doesn't prove a cover-up, but the pattern of obstacles, the consistent resistance, the way information gets suppressed and researchers get discouraged, it all suggests something is being protected. The question is what, and the bigger question is why. What could possibly be buried under the Sahara that's worth this much effort to keep hidden? What truth is so dangerous that it requires this level of control? Maybe we're about to find out. Because the technology keeps getting better. Satellite imaging improves every year. Independent researchers keep trying. The internet makes it harder to suppress information completely. Sooner or later, someone's going to get through. Someone's going to bring back evidence that can't be ignored or explained away. And when that happens, the real questions will finally begin. Stand at the center of the Richat structure and look around. You're standing at the exact middle point of 3 perfect concentric circles that stretch outward for 25 kilometers in every direction. Perfect circles. Not approximate. Not close enough. Perfect. Now ask yourself a simple question. How? How do you create perfect circles 50 kilometers wide without the ability to see them from above? How do you maintain that precision across terrain that rises and falls, across different types of rock, across distances so vast that the curvature of the Earth becomes a factor in your measurements? Modern engineers creating something like this would use GPS satellites, laser surveying equipment, computer modeling, and heavy machinery. They'd need months of planning and millions of dollars in technology, and they'd still struggle to match the mathematical precision of the Richat structure. So how did someone do it thousands of years ago? Or did anyone do it at all? That's the question that keeps geologists and archaeologists arguing, because the standard explanation that this is purely a natural formation created by erosion requires you to believe that random natural processes created mathematical perfection. That wind and water and geological uplift just happened to carve out 3 concentric circles with nearly identical spacing and precisely maintained curvature. It's possible. Nature can create surprisingly regular patterns. Hexagonal basalt columns, perfectly spherical concretions, symmetrical crystal formations. Natural processes following physical laws can produce geometric results. But there's a difference between local symmetry and massive scale precision, a difference between a 6-sided crystal and a 50-kilometer wide bullseye. And that difference is where things get interesting. Let's start with the mathematics, because numbers don't lie even when people do. The spacing between the rings of the Richat structure averages 500 meters. Not exactly 500. It varies by a few dozen meters, depending on where you measure. But the average holds remarkably consistent all the way around the structure. 500 meters. That's roughly 1/3 of a mile. Or, in ancient Greek measurements, about 3 stades. The exact measurement Plato gave for the rings of Atlantis. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's a very specific coincidence. The outer diameter of the structure is approximately 50 kilometers. The middle ring is roughly 30 kilometers. The inner ring about 15 kilometers. These aren't random numbers. They're proportional. Each ring is approximately 2/3 the diameter of the next ring out. That ratio, 2/3, appears throughout ancient architecture. The Parthenon uses it. The pyramids of Giza use variations of it. It's a proportion that's pleasing to the human eye and mathematically significant in ways that ancient cultures seem to understand better than we give them credit for. But here's where it gets strange. If you map the Richat structure using high-precision GPS and then analyze the data, the circles aren't quite perfect. They're elliptical, very slightly elongated. The deviation is only about 2%, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it. 2%. That's the same deviation you get from the pyramids of Giza. Those pyramids are aligned to true north with incredible accuracy, but not perfect accuracy. They're off by about 0.05 degrees. That's well within ancient Egyptian surveying capability, but not quite perfect. The Richat structure's 2% elliptical deviation is similar. It's the kind of imperfection you'd expect from human construction using sophisticated but pre-modern techniques. It's not the kind of imperfection you'd expect from random erosion, which should create much more irregular results. Natural erosion doesn't respect mathematical ratios. It doesn't maintain consistent spacing. It doesn't create proportional relationships between nested features. Natural erosion creates chaos within broad patterns. The Richat structure shows pattern within precision. That bothers geologists more than they usually admit in published papers. But talk to them off the record, buy them a beer at a conference, and they'll tell you the structure makes them uncomfortable. It's too regular, too consistent, too much like something that was planned. But if it was planned, if it was built, then we need to explain how. And that's where we run into problems that make the mystery even deeper. Creating geometric shapes at massive scale requires establishing reference points. You need a center. You need a way to measure distance consistently from that center. You need to maintain straight sightlines across kilometers of terrain. The ancient Romans did this with surveying tools called groma and libra. Essentially sophisticated levels and plumb bobs, they could create remarkably straight roads and precisely measured boundaries. But the scale was limited. A few kilometers at most before cumulative errors became too large to correct. The Richat structure is 50 kilometers wide. Maintaining precision at that scale requires either advanced technology or a technique we've lost or never knew existed. There's a theory, controversial but not easily dismissed, about acoustic surveying. The idea that ancient cultures used sound waves to measure distance and establish positions. Sound travels at a known speed. If you can create a loud enough noise and accurately measure the time it takes for the echo to return, you can calculate distance with precision. We know ancient cultures understood acoustics better than we typically assume. Greek amphitheaters have acoustic properties that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Mayan pyramids create strange echo effects that sound like bird calls. The stones at Stonehenge were apparently chosen partially for their acoustic resonance. But using sound to survey at the scale of the Richat structure would require technology we have no evidence existed. Sound sources powerful enough to generate measurable echoes across dozens of kilometers. Timing mechanisms accurate to fractions of a second. Understanding of acoustic propagation through different atmospheric conditions. It seems impossible, which leaves us with the same question. How? There's also the matter of what the Richat structure is made of. Not just the geology, but the specific arrangement of materials. The rings consist of alternating bands of different rock types. Sandstone, limestone, dolomite, volcanic rock. Each band has different properties, different hardness, different erosion, resistance, different colors. From space, these bands create a striking visual effect. The rings stand out clearly in satellite imagery because each type of rock reflects light differently. It's beautiful, almost deliberately beautiful, like someone designed it for aesthetic effect. Geologists explain this as the result of differential erosion. The dome that created the Richat structure was made of layers of different rock types. As erosion wore down the dome, the harder rocks eroded more slowly, creating ridges. The softer rocks eroded faster, creating valleys. Over millions of years, this process created the ring pattern we see today. That's a reasonable explanation. It fits what we know about geological processes. It doesn't require any mysterious ancient technology or lost knowledge, but it also requires remarkable luck. It requires that the original geological dome was created with perfectly concentric layers of alternating rock types, that these layers were deposited with consistent thickness and spacing, that the subsequent erosion was perfectly symmetrical, wearing down the structure evenly from all sides. Possible? Yes. Likely? That's where opinions diverge. There's another detail that doesn't quite fit the natural formation narrative. The center of the Richat structure is elevated. It's a hill, rising about 200 meters above the surrounding terrain. This hill is made primarily of volcanic rock, different from the sedimentary layers that form the rings. The geological explanation is that this volcanic intrusion pushed up the sedimentary layers, creating the dome that would later erode into rings. The volcanic rock, being harder than the surrounding sediments, eroded more slowly and remained as the central hill. But here's the problem. If the volcanic intrusion was powerful enough to push up kilometers of overlying rock, we should see more evidence of disturbance. Fractured rock, fault lines radiating outward, signs of the violent forces required to create such a structure. Instead, the sedimentary layers around the volcanic center are remarkably intact. They're tilted, pushed upward along the edges, but not shattered or heavily faulted. It's like they were gently lifted rather than explosively forced upward. One maverick geologist, who requested his name not be used because this theory hasn't helped his career, suggested an alternative explanation. What if the central hill isn't the cause of the structure but part of it? What if something was built at the center, and the rings were constructed around it, and the volcanic rock was either quarried and placed, or naturally occurring and incorporated into the design? That would explain why the sedimentary layers aren't more disrupted. They weren't pushed up by volcanic force. They were arranged, shaped, used as building materials for a massive construction project. It's a wild theory. It requires advanced construction capability that we have no other evidence existed, but it explains the anomalies better than the conventional geological model does. And then there are the straight lines. In 2018, a satellite imaging specialist named Marcus Webb was processing high-resolution imagery of the Sahara for a climate change study. He was looking at how sand dune patterns shift over time. What he found instead were lines. Long, perfectly straight lines running beneath the sand. Not ancient rivers, which meander. Not geological faults, which are irregular. Straight lines, some of them running for over 20 kilometers without deviating more than a few degrees. Several of these lines intersect at the Richat structure. They converge on it from different directions, like spokes on a wheel, or like roads leading to a central hub. Webb published his findings in a remote sensing journal. The paper got minimal attention. Most reviewers assumed the lines were imaging artifacts, glitches in the satellite data. Webb insisted they weren't. He showed that the lines appeared consistently across multiple satellite passes, multiple sensors, multiple wavelengths of light. They're real features, something beneath the sand that's causing consistent variations in surface temperature and reflectivity, something linear and extensive and connected to the Richat structure. Webb speculated they might be ancient roads, packed earth or stone pathways that were buried as the desert advanced but remained denser than the surrounding sand, creating subtle differences in how heat and light interact with the surface. If they're roads, they're incredibly well engineered. Maintaining straight sightlines across 20 kilometers requires sophisticated surveying. Building roads that remain intact and identifiable after thousands of years of burial requires advanced construction techniques. Or maybe they're not roads, maybe they're something else. Irrigation canals, trade routes marked with stones, property boundaries, or something we can't even conceive of because we're looking at it through the wrong conceptual framework. The point is, they exist. They're measurable. They connect to the Richat structure, and nobody can adequately explain them using conventional archaeology or geology. Let's talk about the metal fragments again, because there's more to that story. The alloy composition that didn't match any known historical metallurgy. Further analysis revealed something even stranger. The metal contained trace elements that suggested extremely high temperature processing, temperatures that Bronze Age or Iron Age furnaces couldn't reach. Modern metallurgy can achieve those temperatures. We use electrical induction furnaces and precise atmospheric control, but ancient metallurgy was limited by what you could achieve with charcoal or wood fires and bellows. Maximum temperatures around 1100 degrees Celsius. Enough for bronze, barely enough for iron. Not enough for the processing temperatures indicated by the metal fragments from near the Richat structure. The metallurgist who analyzed the samples, the one who eventually released the data publicly, wrote in his notes that the metal showed signs of vacuum processing, absence of oxidation that should occur during high-temperature working, as if it had been melted and formed in an environment without oxygen. That's impossible with ancient technology. That requires sealed chambers and vacuum pumps, equipment that didn't exist until the Industrial Revolution, unless it did exist. Unless we've underestimated what ancient metallurgists were capable of, or unless the dating is wrong and the metal is much more recent than the thermoluminescence testing suggested. But if the dating is right, if that metal really is 8,000 years old, then we're missing something fundamental about ancient technology. We're missing entire chapters of human technical development that aren't supposed to exist. There's one more piece to this technological puzzle, one more anomaly that doesn't fit comfortably into any explanation. The Richat structure sits at almost exactly 21 degrees north latitude and 11 degrees west longitude. Those numbers might not mean anything to you. They didn't mean anything to researchers either, until someone started looking at other ancient sites. Giza, 29.979 degrees north. That's almost exactly 30 degrees. And the minor deviation is because the pyramids were built to align with the North Pole's position 4,000 years ago, which has shifted slightly due to precession. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, 13 degrees north. Easter Island, 27 degrees south. Nazca Lines in Peru, 14 degrees south. Major ancient sites cluster around specific latitudes. Not randomly, they tend to appear at latitudes that are simple fractions of 90 degrees. 1/3, 1/4, 1/5. As if ancient builders were deliberately choosing locations based on geometric principles related to the Earth's sphere. The Richat structure at 21 degrees north is close to 1/4 of 90 degrees. 22.5 degrees would be exact. 21 is close enough to suggest intentional placement, or at least awareness that latitude matters. Why would latitude matter to ancient builders? Unless they understood that the Earth was round, unless they had some method of measuring their position on the globe, unless they were working from a much more sophisticated understanding of geography and mathematics than we credit them with. Every time you pull on one thread of the Richat structure mystery, you find it connected to another thread. The perfect circles connect to ancient surveying techniques we don't understand. The surveying connects to acoustic or astronomical methods we can't prove existed. The methods connect to mathematical knowledge that seems too advanced for the supposed time period. The mathematics connect to global patterns of ancient construction that suggest coordination or shared knowledge across vast distances. And all of it circles back to the same central question. If this structure was built, who had the knowledge and technology to build it? And if they had that knowledge and technology, what else were they capable of that we haven't discovered yet? The more we learn, the less sense the conventional explanations make, and the more fascinating the alternatives become. Here's something that doesn't make the evening news. Right now, at this very moment, there are hundreds of archaeological sites around the world that have been discovered but never fully excavated, places where ground-penetrating radar has shown massive structures beneath the surface, places where initial excavations revealed artifacts that challenged accepted timelines, places that were then quietly closed, covered back up, and forgotten. The Richat structure isn't alone. It's part of a pattern, and that pattern raises a question that makes people uncomfortable. Is someone actively managing what we're allowed to know about human history? Not through some dramatic conspiracy with secret meetings and shadowy organizations, but through bureaucracy, funding decisions, academic gatekeeping, and the quiet suppression of inconvenient discoveries. Let's start with Turkey, because what's happening there is too blatant to ignore. Göbekli Tepe. You've probably heard of it. Massive stone temple complex in southeastern Turkey, dated to 9500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. It's the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet, hadn't formed cities, were barely out of the Stone Age according to conventional timelines. The site has over 200 stone pillars, some weighing 16 tons. They're carved with sophisticated reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. They're arranged in circular enclosures with apparent astronomical alignments. The whole complex covers about 22 acres. Here's what most people don't know. Only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. 5%. After more than 25 years of archaeological work, the rest remains buried, mapped by ground-penetrating radar, but left untouched. Why? The official explanation is preservation. Once you expose ancient structures to air and weather, they begin to deteriorate. Better to leave most of the site buried until we have better preservation technology. That's reasonable. That makes sense. Except for one problem. The Turkish government has built a massive modern structure over the excavated portions. A protective enclosure that looks like an airport hangar. It cost millions of dollars. It's designed to last for decades. They've clearly committed to the site being accessible long-term. So why not excavate more? Why not gradually expose additional areas under that same protective structure? Why leave 95% of potentially civilization-changing discoveries buried in the ground, unless what they've already found in that 5% is problematic enough? Unless excavating more would make the problems worse? Unless the decision has been made that some questions are better left unasked? The lead archaeologist at Göbekli Tepe, Klaus Schmidt, spent decades working at the site. In 2014, he died suddenly of a heart attack while swimming. He was 61. In interviews before his death, Schmidt had become increasingly vocal about wanting to expand excavations, about his frustration with the restrictions placed on his work. After his death, excavation pace slowed even further. New regulations were implemented requiring additional approval layers for any new digging. The site became harder to access for independent researchers. Maybe these are reasonable preservation measures. Maybe Schmidt's death was purely coincidental. Maybe the slow pace of excavation is just responsible archaeology. Or maybe Göbekli Tepe revealed something that powerful interests don't want fully exposed. Something about human capability 11,000 years ago that doesn't fit the narrative we've been taught. Now look at South America, the Amazon rainforest specifically. For centuries, the accepted wisdom was that the Amazon was pristine wilderness, that it had never supported large human populations because the soil was too poor for agriculture, that the indigenous people who lived there were small, scattered groups with minimal impact on the landscape. Then LiDAR happened. Light detection and ranging technology. Basically laser scanning from aircraft that can penetrate through jungle canopy and map the ground beneath. Between 2010 and 2020, LiDAR surveys of the Amazon revealed something staggering. The jungle is full of structures, thousands of them. Earthworks, road systems, agricultural complexes, settlements that house tens of thousands of people. These aren't small villages. They're sophisticated urban centers with geometric layouts, defensive structures, water management systems. Some of the geometric earthworks are over 1 kilometer across, perfect squares and circles carved into the landscape, similar in scale to European megalithic structures, but completely unknown until satellite and LiDAR technology revealed them. The estimates keep growing. Some archaeologists now believe the Amazon basin supported populations of over 8 million people before European contact. 8 million. In an area we thought was uninhabited wilderness. And here's the key point. Most of these sites haven't been ground surveyed. The LiDAR data exists, the locations are known, but actual archaeological investigation has been minimal. Funding is scarce. Access is restricted. the sites remain mostly untouched. Brazil has the resources to excavate these sites. They have universities, archaeologists, research institutions, but the work isn't happening at the scale the discoveries warrant. And when researchers ask why, the answers get vague. Environmental concerns, indigenous rights issues, budget constraints, all valid concerns, all legitimate reasons for careful, measured approach. But taken together, across dozens of sites, across years of delayed investigation, it starts to look like avoidance. Like someone has decided these discoveries are too disruptive to pursue aggressively. Because if the Amazon supported advanced civilizations with populations in the millions, then the entire story of pre-Columbian America needs to be rewritten. The diseases brought by Europeans didn't just kill indigenous people, they wiped out entire civilizations that we never knew existed. Civilizations that might have had knowledge and technology that was lost completely. That's a narrative problem. That challenges ideas about European discovery and conquest. That raises uncomfortable questions about what was destroyed and what we'll never know because of it. Let's go even further. Antarctica. In 2016, a team using ice-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a pyramid-shaped structure beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Not a natural mountain. A structure with apparently smooth sides and geometric proportions. The discovery was announced. It made news for about 48 hours. Then, silence. No follow-up expedition was organized. No additional surveys were conducted. The Antarctic Treaty, which governs research on the continent, suddenly became very strict about approving new geological surveys in that specific region. The official explanation was environmental protection. Can't disturb the pristine Antarctic wilderness. Can't risk contaminating ancient ice cores. But researchers had been drilling ice cores in Antarctica for decades. They'd been conducting seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar studies routinely. Suddenly, for this one specific anomaly, the environmental concerns became paramount. The images from that initial radar survey are still available if you know where to look. They show something with straight edges and angular geometry under nearly a mile of ice. Natural formation? Possibly. Worthy of investigation? Absolutely. Being investigated? No. And it's not just Antarctica. Similar patterns appear everywhere. In Bosnia, there's a hill called Visosica. Some researchers claim it's actually a pyramid, covered by soil and vegetation over thousands of years. Ground-penetrating radar shows internal chambers and passages. Geometric anomalies consistent with construction rather than natural formation. The Bosnian government initially supported excavation, then international archaeology organizations condemned the work as pseudoscience. Funding dried up. The lead researcher became persona non grata in academic circles. Excavation continues on a shoestring budget with volunteer labor, but it's been marginalized to the point of irrelevance. Maybe Visosica really is just a hill. Maybe the radar anomalies have natural explanations. But why the aggressive suppression? Why not allow proper scientific investigation to definitively prove or disprove the claims? Unless the concern isn't about proving it's false. Unless the concern is about what happens if it turns out to be true. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Archaeology is controlled by a relatively small group of institutions, major universities, government heritage departments, international organizations like UNESCO. These institutions decide what gets excavated, what gets funded, what gets published, what gets taught, and they have every incentive to maintain the accepted narrative. Academic careers are built on established frameworks. Textbooks represent enormous investments. Museum exhibitions cost millions to create. Entire departments are structured around teaching specific timelines and theories. Discoveries that challenge those frameworks are disruptive. They're expensive. They require admitting previous conclusions were wrong. They demand resources to investigate properly. They create uncertainty where there was confidence. It's easier to dismiss them, easier to deny permits, easier to withhold funding, easier to use the peer review process to block publication, not through explicit conspiracy, but through institutional inertia and self-interest. But there's something darker in the pattern too, something that goes beyond academic gatekeeping. Why do researchers investigating these sites have such a high rate of accidents, health problems, and career destruction? Why do permits get revoked at the last minute? Why does equipment get seized? Why do data drives get wiped? The bureaucratic obstacles could be explained by institutional resistance to change, but the personal targeting feels like something more deliberate. There's a researcher named Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University. He studied the water erosion on the Sphinx in Egypt, and concluded it's much older than conventional Egyptology claims, possibly 9,000 years old instead of 4,000. His evidence is solid. The erosion patterns are consistent with rainfall, and Egypt hasn't had significant rainfall since the end of the last ice age. His geological analysis has been peer-reviewed and holds up to scrutiny. But Egyptologists have spent decades trying to destroy his reputation, not debating his evidence, not conducting counter-studies, just attacking him personally, questioning his credentials, dismissing his work without serious engagement. Why? Because if the Sphinx is 9,000 years old, then Egyptian civilization is older than we thought. And if Egyptian civilization is older, then the timeline of human development needs revision. And if the timeline needs revision, then everything built on that timeline becomes questionable. That's threatening, not to human knowledge, but to human careers and institutional power. Graham Hancock, the journalist and author, has faced similar treatment. He's written extensively about potential advanced civilizations in prehistory. He's not an archaeologist, which gives establishment academics an easy way to dismiss him. But his research is thorough, his sources are documented, and his questions are legitimate. Yet he's been called a pseudoscientist, a charlatan, a danger to real archaeology. Netflix created a documentary series featuring his work, and archaeological organizations demanded it be removed or labeled as fiction, not because his facts were wrong, but because his conclusions challenged accepted wisdom. This isn't scientific debate. This is suppression. And it's not just individuals. It's systematic. Look at how quickly information gets scrubbed from the internet when it relates to these topics. Videos deleted from YouTube, websites taken offline, forum posts removed, academic papers that challenged narratives and then mysteriously disappeared from journal archives. Yes, some of this is normal content moderation. Some of it is copyright enforcement. Some of it is dealing with actual pseudoscience and misinformation. But not all of it. Not when the pattern is this consistent. Not when legitimate research with proper documentation gets the same treatment as obvious conspiracy nonsense. Someone is managing the narrative, maybe not through centralized control, maybe through a network of interests that benefit from maintaining the current story about human history, academic interests, political interests, religious interests that depend on specific timelines being true, or maybe something else. Maybe there are discoveries already made that are being actively concealed because the implications are too disruptive, too threatening to existing power structures, too challenging to the foundational stories our civilization tells about itself. What if the Richat structure, Göbekli Tepe, the Amazon cities, the Antarctic anomalies, what if they're all evidence of something that powerful groups have decided we're not ready to know? What if there was a global civilization before the accepted beginning of civilization? What if they were more advanced than we've been told? What if something catastrophic happened to them, and the survivors deliberately hid or destroyed the evidence? That sounds paranoid. That sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense. But then you look at the suppressed excavations, the revoked permits, the mysterious accidents, the scrubbed data, the coordinated dismissal of legitimate questions, the pattern of obstacles facing anyone who pushes too hard on these mysteries, and you have to wonder. You have to ask yourself whether the paranoid explanation might actually be closer to the truth than the comfortable one. Because if our understanding of human history is wrong, if civilization is older and was more advanced than we've been taught, then every assumption about who we are and where we came from needs to be questioned. And maybe that's exactly what someone is afraid of. So where does all of this leave us? We started with a circular structure in the Sahara Desert, 50 kilometers wide, perfectly proportioned, sitting exactly where ancient texts described a lost civilization, surrounded by evidence of advanced technology, sophisticated engineering, and mysteries that no one seems willing to properly investigate. We've looked at the connections to Atlantis that are too precise to be coincidental. We've examined the evidence that the Sahara was once a paradise that supported large populations and potentially advanced societies. We've documented the pattern of suppressed research, revoked permits, and careers destroyed for asking the wrong questions. We've traced the global network of similar sites that challenge everything we've been taught about human history. And we're left with one unavoidable conclusion. Something is very wrong with the official story. Either the Richat structure and sites like it represent natural formations that just happen to look impossibly precise, and just happen to match ancient descriptions and just happen to have anomalous artifacts nearby, or they're evidence of capabilities and civilizations that aren't supposed to have existed. Both explanations have problems. The natural formation explanation requires too many coincidences. The ancient civilization explanation requires rewriting timelines that generations of scholars have worked to establish. But here's the thing. Evidence doesn't care about our comfort level. Truth doesn't adjust itself to fit academic careers or institutional investments. Reality is what it is, regardless of how inconvenient that might be. And the reality is this. Human history, as we understand it, has massive gaps. We have a story that goes hunter-gatherers, agricultural revolution, first cities, early civilizations, written history. That story is taught in every school. It's presented as established fact, but it's a story with about 300,000 years missing. Modern humans, biologically identical to us, have existed for at least that long, probably longer. For the vast majority of that time, we're told they did essentially nothing. Survived, reproduced, made simple tools, but didn't develop complex societies or advanced knowledge. Then suddenly, almost overnight in geological terms, civilization appears. Cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, metallurgy, all of it emerges in multiple locations around the world within a few thousand years of each other. The standard explanation is that agriculture enabled population growth, which enabled specialization, which enabled technological development. That's logical. That makes sense. But it doesn't explain sites like Göbekli Tepe, built before agriculture. It doesn't explain the astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures worldwide. It doesn't explain how different cultures on different continents developed similar technologies and mythologies within the same narrow time window. Unless they weren't starting from scratch, unless they were rebuilding, unless there was something before, something that was lost, and the civilizations we know about are actually the recovery phase, not the beginning. That's not a new idea. Plato suggested it with his Atlantis story. Indigenous cultures worldwide have flood myths and stories of previous worlds that were destroyed. Even some ancient historians wrote about cycles of civilization, ages of humanity that rose and fell. We dismissed those stories as mythology, as primitive people trying to explain natural disasters without scientific knowledge. But what if they were history? What if they were the faded memories of something that actually happened? The evidence from the Richat structure and sites like it suggests that's not impossible. It suggests that between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, during the African humid period when the Sahara was green, sophisticated societies existed. They had knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, engineering. They built structures we struggle to explain even with modern technology. Then something happened. Climate change, catastrophe, whatever triggered the end of the Ice Age and transformed the Sahara from paradise to desert. Those societies collapsed. Most of their people died or scattered. Their knowledge was lost. Their structures were buried under advancing sand. The survivors carried fragments of that knowledge to other regions, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and those fragments became the foundation for the civilizations we do know about, the ones that appeared so suddenly and so fully formed in the historical record. That narrative fits the evidence better than the standard story does. It explains the anomalies. It accounts for the advanced knowledge that early civilizations seem to possess without apparent development time. It makes sense of the global patterns and the similar technologies appearing in distant locations. But it's not the story we're told. It's not in the textbooks, and anyone who suggests it publicly faces professional consequences. Why? That's the question that matters now. If the evidence supports a revision of human history, why the resistance? Why the suppression? Why the coordinated effort to prevent investigation of sites that could answer these questions definitively? Maybe it's just institutional inertia. Maybe it's academic ego. Maybe it's the difficulty of admitting we've been teaching the wrong timeline for generations. Or maybe it's something more calculated. Maybe there are discoveries that have already been made, evidence that's being deliberately concealed, because the truth would be too disruptive to existing power structures. Religious institutions depend on specific creation timelines and historical narratives. Political systems derive legitimacy from historical claims. Economic interests control resources at sites that might have archaeological significance. All of these groups have reasons to prefer the current story over a revised one. And then there's the possibility that scares people most. What if ancient civilizations were more advanced than we are in certain ways? What if they had knowledge we've lost? What if studying their remains would reveal capabilities that would destabilize current technological and economic systems? That sounds like science fiction. But so did the idea of a green Sahara until we proved it. So did the idea of cities in the Amazon until LiDAR revealed them. So did the idea of sophisticated structures 11,000 years old until we found Göbekli Tepe. We keep discovering that the impossible is actually just the not yet accepted. The technology exists right now to answer these questions. Ground-penetrating radar can map what's beneath the Sahara without disturbing it. LiDAR can reveal structures under vegetation and sand. Advanced dating techniques can establish timelines with precision. DNA analysis can trace ancient populations and their movements. We have the tools. What we lack is the will. Or more accurately, what we lack is permission from the gatekeepers who control access, funding, and academic legitimacy. But that's changing. Crowdfunding allows independent research. Social media lets people share discoveries without traditional gatekeepers. Technology becomes cheaper and more accessible every year. The ability to suppress information decreases as the ability to gather and distribute it increases. Sooner or later, someone is going to get definitive evidence from the Richat structure or a site like it. Evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Evidence that forces the conversation we've been avoiding. And when that happens, when we finally have to confront the reality of human history rather than the comfortable story we've been telling, everything changes. Our understanding of human potential changes. Our assumptions about technological progress change. Our ideas about what was lost and what might be recovered change. Maybe even our sense of where we're headed changes. Because if we've done this before, if we've built advanced civilizations that collapsed, then we need to understand why. We need to know what mistakes they made so we don't repeat them. The Richat structure sits in the Sahara, exactly where it's been for thousands of years, waiting for us to be ready to ask the right questions, waiting for us to be brave enough to accept answers that don't fit our preconceptions, waiting for technology and will to align in a way that finally reveals its secrets. That day is coming. Whether it's next year or next decade, it's coming. The evidence is accumulating. The obstacles are weakening. The questions are being asked by more people in more places. And when the truth finally emerges, when we finally understand what the Eye of Africa really is and what it represents, human history will never be the same. The mystery isn't going away. It's getting bigger, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. All we can do is keep watching, keep questioning, keep demanding transparency and real investigation. Keep pushing for answers even when powerful interests prefer we stop asking. Because beneath that sand, beneath those perfect circles, beneath the bureaucratic obstacles and the academic gatekeeping and the coordinated suppression, there's truth waiting to be discovered. And that truth belongs to all of us, not to institutions or governments or academic gatekeepers, to humanity, to anyone willing to look at the evidence honestly and follow it wherever it leads. The lost kingdom beneath the Sahara isn't lost because we can't find it. It's lost because we've been prevented from looking. But you can't hide the truth forever. Eventually, the sand shifts. Eventually, the structures beneath are revealed. Eventually, the questions become too loud to ignore. That moment is closer than the gatekeepers want us to believe. And when it arrives, when we finally see what's really there, the only question left will be why it took us so long to look. The sand is shifting. The technology is ready. The questions are being asked. All we need now is the courage to hear the answers. And maybe, just maybe, we're finally ready.